Now let's take a look at button versus big blind on Jack 6-2. So here, button raises pre-flop, big blind calls with a very wide range. Flop comes Jack 6-2, big blind checks, button bets small, big blind calls. So whenever big blind's facing a small bet from a loose range, the big blind should stick around a pretty decent chunk of the time, which means they're going to get to the turn with a lot of very marginal holdings, right? I mean, so is the button, but both players' ranges are going to be pretty marginal. And you see in this scenario on the turn, out of position's equity is usually never all that great. So this is a spot where even though some of the junk was folded out on the flop, a lot of the hands in the big blind's range is still going to be pretty marginal on the turn. So let's take a look at this. Say we are big blind versus button here against a big bet on a 7 of spades turn. Now, you may not see a big bet out of all that many players in the real world because a lot of people just bet half pot or 2/3 pot. But this is a scenario where, from a GTO point of view, the player on the button, if they want to continue betting on the turn, should use a big bet. Now, what should you do when facing a big bet? Go through, categorize your hands, and try to be a little bit aggressive with folding out the weaker portion of your perhaps normal marginal made range that you would call a smaller bet with. So let's just go through here. What are our premium hands? That's going to be 2 pairs. What are our draws? Well, given our 2 pairs could easily be beat, we want to make sure our draws are hands that have equity. That said, I can already tell you, we should not be raising all that often in this spot, if ever. Remember back to the previous section where we talked about against an overbet, you should basically never raise. That's because against an overbet, your opponent is essentially saying they're very, very polarized. So you see here that we have way too many draws in our range, but I can already tell you, because we're facing this big bet, we're not going to be raising all that often. Therefore, these two ratios can be somewhat out of balance because we're not actually raising. Whenever you're raising, you want to make sure you don't have too many draws. When you're calling, though, if you're getting the right price plus implied odds, then you can still stick around. So if you take a look at this, too, like all these draws that are sticking around with are pairs plus draws, which are pretty good hands. In theory, you could call these like strong marginal made hands. Basically, don't get too worked up on the exact categories of these hands. All right, marginal made hands. These are going to be just pairs. And our junk is going to be unpaired hands that check called flop, and also the weakest pairs. That's going to be like pocket 4s, 6-5, 8-6, king 2. And I have a lot of these other hands, I'm sure, categorized as junk, like king 2 with no flush draw. I'm sure that is categorized as junk here as well, right? So all these without a pair, or I'm sorry, without a flush draw are also junk. Okay, so that has us folding out 47%. That's a lot, but realize the opponent's betting big, which means we should be folding out a lot. GTO strategy is to actually fold out 56% of the time, which is huge, right? Solver does fold out most ace highs, most king highs without draws, of course. Sevens, looks like they all stick around. Sixes, looks like the weakest sixes do fold out, as we can see. Looks like the 2s, for the most part, fold out as well. So that all makes sense. Also, take a look, essentially no raising, right? And that's because we completely lack the nut advantage when the opponent is overbetting. When the opponent overbets, we have to be very, very cautious. And that also generally applies when they're betting big, assuming they're betting big with a polarized range. Like if you're playing against someone in your games who makes a pot size bet, and you think a pot size bet is super strong and polarized, then in turn, you should still play pretty tightly. Now, if the opponent was playing using a much smaller bet size, now we would have to stick around much more often with stuff like all of these weaker pairs, right? Really just have to stick around much wider when we're facing a substantially smaller bet. Now let's take a look at the turned ace. Now we're going to be facing a 67% pot bet. That's the most common bet size in this scenario on the turn. So you see we're going to end up folding out a little bit less, even though this turn is not particularly great. Again, there weren't any really great turns for us in this scenario anyway. So go through, categorize your hands. Now that we're facing a smaller bet size, we should probably go ahead and raise with our best hands if they make up a reasonable portion of our range. So yeah, I think this all looks nice. We're check raising our decent top pairs and 2 pairs. You may say, is ace-9 really good enough to get it in? It's close. It's close. Probably. And then we're going to be raising pairs and draws that have decent equity when called. And then everything else is very clearly marginal. I'm check calling turn with king 10. It's still a gut shot with king high. This is a spot where we can call king high on the turn, and then if it goes check, check on the river, we do win every once in a while. At least the best king highs. with gut shot, with additional equity. I am folding out some weak pairs. 6-5 should be folded here, probably. So that's a bit of an oversight by me. But yeah, everything else looks reasonable, right? We're folding out these hands without draws, the twos over here. So similar strategy to before. So I like this play. So yeah, here we see 6-5 folding, like I said, and 6-5 should be folding. Notice a lot of the sixes actually fold, a lot of the weaker sixes. So I was calling these weaker sixes, but it seems like solver likes to fold them. I was sticking around 35%. Solver sticks around... I'm sorry, I was folding 35. Solver folds 41, so that's going to be where that comes from. Notice solver does stick around with king 10. Even though it is unpaired, it's a hand you can check call with and then proceed to the river. Solver does raise ace 10 and ace 9 and some ace 8s. So, seems reasonable. I mean, you have to understand, we're not thrilled about having an ace with a 10 kicker or an ace with a 9 kicker. Maybe the play is to just call. I could definitely get behind the idea of calling in this spot with that hand. But when you are facing a smaller bet size, you should probably go ahead and put in the raise some portion of the time with your strong top pairs. I know this is something a lot of people do and not something that I advocate a whole lot. And as you are playing deeper and deeper stacked, you will raise less often with these types of hands, because if you get it in for 100 big blinds with ace 9 or ace 10, you're probably in pretty bad shape. But if you get it in for 40 big blinds, once the pot's already starting to become pretty substantial, you're going to be fine enough. So I think all these strategies make sense. Let's take a look at the bluffs that are bluffing. It's going to be, looks like just diamond draws, right? These hands all in here. This hand, these hands, all these are diamond draws and whatnot. So that all makes good, logical sense.